UN have been always part of this conflict since the beginning, since years. The UN have established with its different agencies the cornerstone which the diplomacy of Palestine have based their work on, in addition to going to the ICC. Nonetheless, so many people ask the same question. Since the law refuses the prolonged occupation, and since so many of the actions of Israelis are violations, why don't we see something different on the ground? Is it because the laws are not activated, or because they have procedures and interpretations which need to be revisited, taking into consideration the power balance and the history? Palestine in the UN, between the fixed and the changing and the future, is the title of our third session of this conference. I would like to welcome you, Mr. Ardi Imseis, who is going to facilitate this session. He is the deputy of in Queen's University, an assistant professor and a member of working in the UN on Yemen, and he had been working with UNRWA, and he's the one who have written UN and the issue of Palestine, the structure of the international law, and this is going to be issued by Cambridge University soon. He used to be also the auditor of the yearly Palestine book. I would like to welcome you, Mr. Ramses. I would like to welcome Professor John Dugard and Professor Falk and Michael Lynk. I leave the floor for you to introduce them and to run this session. I would like to welcome you all.
Thank you so very much, Mona. I really do appreciate that. Please allow me to offer my sincere thanks to begin with to the organizers of today's conference, in particular Hassan, Adil, and all of you in the team for your leadership and work in bringing together all of us, despite our divergent times and places. In this regard, I'd like to offer a special thanks on behalf of everyone to the inimitable Richard Falk for joining us from California, where it is presently 0300 hours in the morning. Thank you very much, Richard.
Glad to be part of this event.
Of course. For those of us who devoted any time to human rights in Palestine through the creative and critical use of international law and institutions, I can hardly think of a better way to mark this International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people than to have been asked to moderate such an esteemed panel of guests. I should like to begin with a quote, if I might. In his 1987 memoir, former Undersecretary General of the United Nations, Brian Urquhart, soberly noted, and I quote, "The involvement of the United Nations in the Palestine problem over the years has twisted the organization's image and fragmented its reputation and prestige as no other issue has." End quote. As a partial reflection of my own time as United Nations official in occupied Palestine and my desire to be critical of the way the organization and international law has engaged with the place and its people over time, in a forthcoming book on the United Nations and the question of Palestine, I attempt to examine how and why Urquhart's observation still resonates with us today. The received wisdom posits that the United Nations is the custodian of the rules-based international legal order. But has it lived up to this ideal when it comes to Palestine? To what extent has the UN been part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution? What UN machinery has been problematic and why? What UN machinery may offer prospects for positive change and why? And finally, what do trends in both the legal and political realm tell us of where we may be headed in the future with Palestine at the UN? With me here today to discuss these and other related questions are Professors John Dugard, Richard Falk, and Michael Lynk. To my knowledge, this has been the first time all three of these men have shared a public stage. The uniqueness of this event rests in the fact that each of them have held the post of United Nations Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied by Israel since 1967, for what will be an aggregate total of almost 20 years by the time the last of them steps down from this role in March next year. Together, their work stands out as the most consistent and principled expression of international law on the question of Palestine ever articulated through the UN machinery since the organization's ill-fated engagement with the problem in 1947. Together, these men have borne witness to the enduring plight of the Palestinian people and Palestine since 1967 in ways that few have, giving them a privileged position from which to share their important views with us today. In doing so, they've helped keep the Palestinian people's story front and center at the United Nations, helping to sharpen our collective understanding of the situation as it has evolved over time, as much as helping shape new paths for us to take on the road to resolving that problem once and for all. We've been given 2 hours for this panel. Following this brief introduction, I will hand the floor over to each of our panelists, who will be given roughly 5 minutes or so to offer their opening remarks. That will be followed by a conversation based on a few questions I prepared for another 30 or 40 minutes. We will then go to questions and answers from the audience for about 30 minutes or so, and we will close with a special ceremony honoring Richard and John. First, a brief introduction of our distinguished guests. John Dugard is Professor Emeritus of International Law at Leiden University. A renowned legal academic who pioneered the human rights movement in South Africa, John founded the Center of Applied Legal Studies at the University of Witwatersrand, which did path-breaking work in advocacy and litigation in support of human rights during the apartheid years. After the fall of apartheid in South Africa, he pursued a celebrated career in international law as the director of the Lauterpacht Center for International Law at Cambridge, where he was a fellow of Sydney Sussex College, a member of the International Law Commission, a member of the Institut de Droit International, and judge ad hoc of the International Court of Justice. His writings include work on diplomatic protection, international criminal justice, the crime of apartheid, state secession, and recognition. He served as the UN Special Rapporteur for Occupied Palestine from 2001 to 2008. Richard Falk is Albert G. Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law and Practice, Princeton University, and visiting Distinguished Professor of Global Studies, University of California at Santa Barbara. He was chair of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation Board of Directors until 2012, served as Honorary Vice President of the American Society of International Law, and is a member of the editorial boards of the American Journal of International Law, Foreign Policy, and The Nation, among many other periodicals. A prolific scholar activist, Richard has co-authored or edited over 30 books and numerous essays that have covered subjects as broad as one can think of, including nuclear proliferation and disarmament, American imperialism, the Vietnam War, world government, use of force, the responsibility to protect, and ecocide. He served as UN Special Rapporteur for Occupied Palestine from 2008 to 2014. And finally, Michael Lynk is Associate Professor and former Associate Dean of Law, Western University. He teaches, researches, and writes in labor, international human rights, disability, constitutional and administrative law. He's also taught at the University of Ottawa, Carleton University, and Victoria University of Wellington. A longtime practitioner of labor law here in Canada, Michael is a vice chair with the Ontario Grievance Settlement Board. He's also the co-author of Trade Union Law in Canada, co-editor of Globalization and the Future of Labor Law, and International Law and the Middle East Conflict. Other academic work of his has appeared in the Max Planck Encyclopedia of Public International Law, the Osgoode Hall Law Journal, the Netherlands Quarterly of Human Rights, and the Journal of Palestine Studies. He is the current UN Special Rapporteur for Occupied Palestine and has been in that position since 2016. Without further ado, and in chronological order of their tenure as UN Special Rapporteurs, it gives me great pleasure to hand the floor over to John, followed by Richard, and then Michael for their opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ardi, for those kind words of introduction. Let me start by saying that my approach to the subject of the United Nations and Palestine is inevitably colored by my experience as a South African who opposed apartheid in that country. During the apartheid era in South Africa, we looked to the United Nations for hope and for a solution to the problem of apartheid in South Africa. And although it took many years, the United Nations was always pointed in the right direction, and ultimately did play a role in the dismantling and overthrow of apartheid. So as a lawyer and as an activist in South Africa, I was to a large extent guided by the lodestar of the United Nations in my approach to the situation. And I think that I was rewarded because the United Nations did ultimately succeed in contributing to the end of apartheid. Now, when I compare the situation in Palestine, I must confess that I'm very disappointed in the overall conduct of the United Nations. Let me just look at each of the institutions that considers the Palestine question. First of all, let us begin with the Quartet, which has been singled out by the Security Council as the body responsible for promoting peace in the Middle East. And I don't think it's an understatement to say that the Quartet has been quite a disastrous institution. It hasn't contributed in any way at all whatsoever to the solution of peace in the Middle East. It has been guided and obstructed at the same time by the United States and has achieved absolutely nothing. Turning then to the Security Council, here too we find that the Security Council has to a large extent been obstructed by the United States. But what I do find disappointing is that other member states of the United Nations have not been prepared to stand up and to describe the way in which the Security Council has failed in its task to promote peace and justice in the Middle East. I do think that it would have been possible for the other permanent members and the non-permanent members to point out that the United States is simply obstructing the whole peace process. Turning to the General Assembly, I find that the General Assembly has been disappointing in the sense that it has repeated the same old resolutions year after year without responding to new developments. While I was Special Rapporteur, I frequently suggested themes that the General Assembly might pursue, but they never did so. I think it's important that the General Assembly address the question of apartheid, for instance. Civil society has made it very clear that it sees the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory as akin to apartheid. And it's time that the General Assembly addressed this in its resolutions, but to date it has not done so. I think it's also important that it consider recommending action of the kind that the General Assembly did in respect of South Africa, beginning with the imposition of an arms embargo on South Africa. Finally, dealing still with New York, I don't think one should fail to mention that the Secretariat has by and large failed as well. When I was Special Rapporteur, I was always struck by the number of moles that I found in the top echelons of the Secretariat, not the Secretary General himself, who at my time was Kofi Annan, but undersecretaries and important officers in the Secretariat made it very clear to me that they regarded Israel as a state that should be treated very gently. So let me end there, and I will be happy to answer questions of any kind on what I've said and what you may wish to ask Ardi and other questioners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. Richard, over to you.
Well, let me first thank the conveners of this event, and particularly Isan Aden for bringing us together. And it's a particular source of satisfaction to be joined with John and Michael on such an occasion. And this is, of course, the day of solidarity, international solidarity with the Palestinian people. And in a sense, it's a very crucial moment in which to emphasize the strategic role of non-governmental solidarity, the popular solidarity of people, because for the reasons I think that John summarized very well, the intergovernmental structures of diplomacy, as filtered through the UN, have proved to be a huge disappointment in the case of Palestine. And as he pointed out, they did eventually come to play an important role in the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. And it is, in my view, the greatest challenge to global solidarity that pressure be exerted on the UN so that it will be, in a sense, coerced from below to play a comparable role in resolving the Palestinian struggle. Having said that, I think it's important to recognize that the UN was designed to give primacy to geopolitics. There's no other reason to have conferred a right of veto on the most dangerous and powerful political actors in the world. In effect, these actors were the 5 permanent members of the Security Council were given an exemption from any obligation to respect international law, at least within the framework of the UN. It is not surprising that when an issue is of geopolitical importance to one of the 5, and particularly the US, it will block the UN from implementing international law, or indeed the law of the Charter itself. And this has led many people interested in a progressive role for the UN to be disappointed and disenchanted with its place in world politics. I take a somewhat different view of this. I think the UN has shown an incapacity to implement international law when it clashes with geopolitical interests. At the same time, there's a very important level of political engagement that I've called the legitimacy war, which is the authoritative establishment of legal and moral right. And the UN plays and has played all along, a crucial role in the symbolic politics that has been extremely important in shaping world history since 1945. It has been especially important in relation to the anti-colonial wars, all of which have been won by the weaker side militarily. And why have they been won? Essentially, because they prevailed in the legitimacy war, and that was coupled with the mobilization of national resistance that was determined to pay any price for achieving their rights. The Palestinian story is enmeshed with this historical circumstance, in the sense that Palestine was a victim of settler colonialism at the time when colonialism was collapsing all over the world. It was contrary to the flow of history. And because it was contrary to the flow of history, it evoked both a powerful resistance to the imposition of this colonial structure, but also it led Israel to impose what became, from the outset, an apartheid structure to maintain what they call security. And in other words, apartheid was embedded in the creation of a settler colonial state that was under attack internationally and by regional forces and by the people who were displaced from their own country, from their own homeland. And the original sin of Zionism, in my view, is the establishment of a Jewish state in an essentially non-Jewish society. And so it is in this context that I think the recognition of apartheid as the core crime of Israel's occupation and the decisive obstacle to achieving a sustainable peace between these two peoples, it's a moment of hope, in the sense that this understanding of the apartheid core of the oppressive relationship has moved from the fringes of Palestinian radicalism to become the mainstream understanding of the character of the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian people. And I would add in closing that the Israeli recourse to branding its critics as anti-Semites and now calling the 6 widely respected and courageous defenders of human rights in occupied Palestine as terrorist organizations, this, in my view, exhibits Israeli panic, a moral panic, and it's a sign of weakness, not a sign of confidence and strength. And it shows the Israeli recognition that the path that led to South African liberation and the end of apartheid is a path that the Palestinians are beginning to pursue in a way that threatens the apartheid structures of control that Israel has relied upon, and has weakened the unconditional geopolitical support, even in the United States, that has been accorded to Israel. When organizations like Human Rights Watch in the US and B'Tselem in Israel agree on the core reality of apartheid, it is no longer something that can be excluded from the perception of the situation. And so I find hope in the present situation, but the challenge for the rest of the world is to exhibit a more militant form of solidarity than has existed in the past. Let me stop there.
Thank you so very much, Richard. Michael, over to you.
Thanks very much. And let me first of all thank the organizers of today's event. This is a wonderful array of forums and speakers who are participating in this all-day event, and I'm honored to be a small part of this. And of course, I'm listening very closely to both what John and Richard have said, and I find myself in agreement with everything that they've put forth in their opening remarks. I just want to add a few things very quickly. You know, from my experiences, the United Nations, when it's at its very best, you know, is capable of playing an important and indeed an indispensable role regarding the question of Palestine. And just let me mention three things with respect to this. First, you know, it's important that the UN has established a rock-solid, rights-based framework grounded in international law to both supervise this interminable occupation and for establishing the rights to which the Palestinians are entitled to, starting with, obviously, self-determination. You know, secondly, you know, the UN has published many excellent human rights documentations of the many violations committed by Israel during its 54-year-old occupation. This is critical, in my view, because the UN has the credibility and the resources to keep an international spotlight on the injustices endured by the Palestinians. And third, over the years, the UN has provided a vital international political forum, and lately almost the only international political forum, for the question of Palestine to be regularly raised. The General Assembly has stated that the UN has a permanent responsibility over this question until it is satisfactorily resolved in all of its aspects, in order to keep in mind as we dispassionately assess the role of the UN. But I must hasten to add that in my view, the UN is frequently not at its very best when discharging its very considerable responsibilities regarding the question of Palestine. The UN can be, on many occasions, greater than the sum of its parts, particularly with respect to issues like treaty making and with identifying international problems and demonstrating international leadership to find solutions for these deep problems that we face as a global community. But the UN can be, on other issues, much less than the sum of its parts, particularly when one or more influential international actors displays great opposition to preventing the UN from meaningfully address and resolving important global or regional issues. And Palestine is such an issue. Why such passivity from the Security Council on this issue? Why is the UN still part of the Quartet, which Chris Patton, the former European Union Commissioner for Foreign Affairs, had quipped the Quartet sans toi? And why is the UN General Assembly content to watch with its eyes wide open the continually disappearance of Palestine with such passivity? How else are we to evaluate the problem at the very core of this question, which is why has this issue persisted unresolved for 74 years which is almost as old as the UN itself, with absolutely no end in sight. Thanks.
Michael, thank you very much for your opening remarks, and thanks to all three of you for those very thoughtful remarks. It seems that one of the themes that emerges from your remarks is that the UN is a place that might be problematic in terms of options available, say the Security Council, given the primacy of geopolitics, Richard, that you speak of, that is embedded in the charter system. But at the same time, the UN is a place, a site for potential action. Again, going back to you, Richard, you mentioned the legitimacy war, or Michael, you'd mentioned this as well in terms of what the GA can do and, you know, when the UN is operating at its best. And so that gives rise to the following question. What specific actions do the three of you think can be taken in the United Nations to advance the rights of the people of Palestine and finally end this situation? For instance, Michael, you have mentioned in your reports the need to go back to the International Court of Justice for a second advisory opinion on the legality of the continued presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. John, you had mentioned, for instance, likening the situation in South Africa and the struggle in South Africa, the anti-apartheid struggle, with what is happening in Palestine. What possibility, for instance, for the General Assembly to create a new special committee on apartheid, this one focused on the apartheid practiced by Israel? Your thoughts, gentlemen? Why don't we start with John, if I might?
Yes, I know that there's a determined move to resurrect the United Nations Special Committee on Apartheid, which I think would be a start. But one must remember that ultimately it's for the political organs of the United Nations to take action. And while the Security Council is completely hampered from taking action by the US veto, I think it's important that the General Assembly should start to flex its muscles. I cannot understand why it does not use its recommendatory power more positively. What is to prevent the General Assembly from recommending an arms embargo on Israel? When I was Special Rapporteur some 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I recommended that such action be taken. It hasn't even been considered yet. This is really the root of the problem, that Israel is armed by Western powers and is able to commit atrocities in Gaza in particular, but also throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. And I think it's important that the General Assembly should consider recommending an arms embargo. And I think, too, it should also identify Israel's policies as constituting apartheid. I know that this is anathema to many Western states, but I do think there is probably a majority in the United Nations General Assembly that would support the labeling of Israel as an apartheid state. Thank you.
Thanks. Richard?
Well, I certainly agree with what John has just said, and I think the empowerment of the General Assembly is something that is called for not only in relation to Palestine, but in relation to other global issues, including control of nuclear weapons, for instance. But I think the core obstacle is one of political will, and that's why I emphasize so much global solidarity. There has to be an increased awareness and more militant activism in order to generate the political will on the part of the non-Western world to mount an effective challenge. And it seems to me that there are conceptually imaginative ways to mount such a challenge, including an analog to the Uniting for Peace resolution, which declared after the Korean War experience that where the Security Council cannot act effectively to uphold the Charter, there is a residual responsibility in the General Assembly. And I think that could make a significant difference and could lead the non-Western countries to feel a role, that they could play a role in challenging the excesses of geopolitics and taming some of the abuses of the UN Charter.
Thank you for that, Richard. Michael?
I see three possibilities for the UN to play, particularly located at the General Assembly. First is what Richard has just mentioned, and John has mentioned as well, which is Uniting for Peace. That was developed in 1950 because the Security Council was hampered by the threat of veto in the face of the Korean question. I don't see why the General Assembly, recognizing that the General Assembly is today paralyzed on the question of Palestine, primarily because of the ability of the U.S. To bring a veto, why Uniting for Peace resolution can't be initiated. That would, at the very beginning, at the very start, impose an arms embargo on Israel. Remember that this occupation for Israel is at an exceptionally low cost. Israel has decided it can bear the criticism that it sometimes receives from the United Nations, as long as that criticism is without consequences. And as long as that winds up happening, Israel will take it as a means to say, we have freedom to do what we wish with respect to the occupied territories. Only when Israel begins to feel the bite of international sanctions will there be ever any hope for a change in public opinion in Israel and in political direction in Israel as well. A second option, I think, is something I think hopefully we'll talk about in the course of the next hour or so, is the possibility of going back to the International Court of Justice in The Hague for a second advisory opinion. I'm suggesting that it should be done on the question of whether or not the occupation has become illegal or not. The international community, but particularly the West, winds up viewing some aspects of the Israeli occupation as illegal, such as the settlements, such as the annexation of East Jerusalem, or the location of the wall in the West Bank. But it assumes that the occupation is otherwise lawful, and I think that Israel has stepped beyond all of the parameters that have been set out by international humanitarian law and the laws of occupation. And I think it would be an important political as well as legal declaration coming as a request from the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice to ask for an opinion as to whether or not this occupation is illegal. And thirdly, I think it's important for the General Assembly to be able to show its support through resolutions with respect to the ongoing investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. This is the single most important means we have today to try to hold Israel accountable. And I think, as Richard had said, the panic that has been shown by Israel in wanting to designate the 6 Palestinian human rights and humanitarian organizations as terrorist organizations and therefore unlawful comes in part because several of them have been instrumental in bringing forth complaints and evidence to the International Criminal Court, that Israel is in violation of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. These are all important forums to use, and I think I praise the General Assembly for passing overwhelmingly resolutions on Palestine each year, we have to go beyond resolutions and beyond criticism to start to find some meaningful action in support of the end of the occupation.
Thank you very much, Michael. So a question to all of you in follow-up to this. Clearly, more action required by the General Assembly, more meaningful action by the General Assembly. But I think you'd all agree that we don't live in the 1960s, 70s, 80s anymore, where this groundswell of the anti-colonial, post-colonial age produced great support for action in support of the Palestinian people and their cause. Take, for instance, the recognition that the Palestinian people were a juridical people by the United Nations in the 1970s, that the PLO is the sole legitimate representative, that they have a right to self-determination, and that their self-determination unit is the occupied Palestinian territory. All of this legislation, if you like, is produced through the General Assembly during the 1970s, 80s, that is very supportive politically of the Palestinians. In 2021, did the Palestinians enjoy the same level of political support in the General Assembly that goes beyond these resolutions that are passed simply through inertia? And if not, then what of the role of civil society? Richard, you'd mentioned the importance of a more militant civil society. Can you flesh that out for us? Is that the BDS movement? What does that look like? And then, Michael, just to ask you, if I might, on the ICJ second advisory opinion that you're arguing, why is Israel's occupation or presence in the OPT, continued presence, illegal? What is the substance of that? So 2 questions for you. And then, John, of course, you could weigh in as you like. Why don't we start with you, Richard? Is the BDS movement important there?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the BDS is the most visible expression of what I call militant activism on behalf of the Palestinian struggle. And if one relates this to the UN, there's an interesting apparent paradox that the UN repudiated its Zionist, the resolution, I think it was in the 1970s, that Zionism is a form of racism. It withdrew that resolution under geopolitical pressure, great geopolitical pressure, and that was in a way manifested by the fact that the withdrawal had no rationale. It was just a statement of canceling the earlier resolution. But that occurred at the same time as this more authoritative assessment of Israel as not only racist, but as guilty of the crime, international crime of apartheid, coming not from political actors, but from respected, objective human rights NGOs that had a reputation of leaning in the direction of Israel's legitimacy, at least in that basic sense. Even if B'Tselem, for instance, had been critical of various practices, it was within the framework of the legitimacy of the Israeli state. And for Human Rights Watch, which has been associated with liberal Zionism, actually, to make this long, comprehensive report authenticating the allegations of apartheid seems to me to be a challenge to the UN, to the General Assembly, to people all over the world, to take seriously what is the severity of the victimization of the Palestinian people. And I would point to John's very instructive writing recently, that in his judgment, having grown up as an opponent of apartheid in South Africa, that what is occurring in Israel is worse in certain clear respects than what was experienced by the majority population in South Africa. And so it's a moral crisis for international civil society and for the UN and for international law generally.
Thank you. Michael?
Sure. You'd like me to briefly address the issue of what I just raised with respect to why I think it's important to go back to the International Court of Justice for a second advisory opinion after the first one was delivered in 2004, but this time focus on the question of whether the occupation has become illegal. I advocate this, and I said so in a report that I issued a special rapporteur 4 years ago in October 2017. And I say this because I think we're all here today because we believe that Palestine is first and foremost a justice issue. And it has very important political features to it, and has very important legal features to it. And I think because international law is so on board with the Palestinian quest for justice, for an end to the occupation, and for self-determination, that it's important to be able to use that, use the framework of international law and human rights as one important foundation for campaigns to get the United Nations to bring this to an end. So when I wrote my report 4 years ago advocating a second advisory opinion, I said in law that there are 4 important features that any occupier has to obey in order for the occupation to be legitimate. Remember that we're in the 21st century, where alien rule is an exception and can only be justified in the 21st century as a temporary and exceptional circumstance. So what I laid out in my report, I said there are 4 things that we draw from the laws of occupation. First of all, that the occupier cannot annex any of the occupied territory. Second of all, I said that the occupation must be temporary and the occupier must try to bring an end to the occupation and return the territory to the sovereignty, which is the people under occupation, as soon as possible. The third test with respect to this is that during the occupation, the occupier has to act in the best interests of the people under occupation. And the fourth thing I said is that the occupier has to administer the territory in good faith, including acting in compliance with international law and with the directions of the international community and the United Nations. And when you look at the Israeli occupation, 54 years into an occupation, the longest occupation in the modern world, it is in flagrant violation of each of these 4 parts of the test. When you think of modern occupations that probably retained their legality, I think of the American occupation of Japan after the Second World War, roughly 8 to 9 years. The Allied occupation of Western Germany, again, roughly 8 to 9 years. And whatever else we think of with respect to the American-led coalition's occupation of Iraq, that lasted, at least formally, in the ballpark of 8 to 10 years. An occupation that lasts for 54 years, where the belligerent occupier is in active disregard of UN resolutions and in international law, can't be an honest policy difference with the world. It's an occupier that's looking to try to harvest the fruits of its conquest. And that's why I think it'd be important for asking for a second advisory opinion from the ICJ. And I see people are asking, well, what about the idea of raising the issue of apartheid as the basis of a second advisory opinion? I think that's important, and I think any arguments made before the International Court of Justice should probably begin to introduce the framework of apartheid. I think we have to build a constituency both in academia and probably at the United Nations in order to be able to establish the basis for apartheid. That may take us a few years before I think there's a wide enough opinion to be able to get there, and that's why I like the idea of including or recreating a UN committee on apartheid or commission on apartheid that will begin to address this question. But for the immediate point, I think the issue that we can get a positive answer from the ICJ that will have great consequences with respect to both the advancement of the legal front and the political front of this question will be on the issue of illegal occupation.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'd like to turn to John on this because of your experience in dealing with the Southwest Africa matter. And, you had mentioned that the United Nations, John, in your opening remarks, you'd mentioned that the United Nations was successful in helping bring to an end apartheid in South Africa and also in Southwest Africa. But that took some decades. There were 4 advisory opinions on Southwest Africa and Namibia, and it wasn't until the early 90s that apartheid fell. What lessons to be learned from those cases, if you like, for Palestine?
Well, I agree with Michael completely that an advisory opinion on the illegality of the occupation and on the question of apartheid in occupied Palestine would be very helpful. I think its primary purpose would be to delegitimize the Israeli occupation and to make it very difficult for Western powers to continue to support Israel. I think it's important and I must bear in mind that Western powers tend to premise their policies on human rights considerations, even if they don't carry this consideration out in practice. But I do think that if there was a strong advisory opinion, that this would be of great assistance. But on the subject of international courts, let me just reiterate what has been said already, that the International Criminal Court, of course, plays a pivotal role in this whole affair. And the International Criminal Court is not a United Nations body, but I don't see any harm being done if the General Assembly of the United Nations were to express the opinion that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court should take more urgent steps to initiate a prosecution of Israelis responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity in occupied Palestine. The prosecution has taken an inordinate amount of time in order to reach a stage of initiating an investigation. And now it seems to be embarking on a delayed process for the initiation of a prosecution. And I think the General Assembly might attempt to endorse the need for more urgent action on the part of the International Criminal Court. Ardi, could I just raise another issue, however, which stems from the mention of decolonization by Richard in particular. I think it's very sad that states which played a crucial role in the decolonization process, African and Asian states, have forsaken Palestine, which after all is a colonization issue. The regime in occupied Palestine is not only an apartheid regime, it's also a colonial regime. And I recall that Mandela, when he was freed, said that South Africans would not be liberated until Palestine was also liberated. And I find it very strange that there's no initiative on the part of the African Union to identify Palestine more strongly as a decolonization issue. On the contrary, the African Union has recently granted observer status to Israel. And I think one needs to discuss the failure of African and Asian states to identify Palestine as a decolonization issue and to press for the liberation of Palestine as it did in respect of other states in the decolonization era.
Thank you, John. Actually, that's a nice segue into another question that I had. And it goes slightly beyond the remit of the United Nations organization as a body, but to its constituent parts, really. What role third states in bringing to bear international law and the weight of international law on the occupying power and in support of the Palestinian people in line with international law, even domestically? Any views there? Why don't we begin with you, Richard?
If I understand the question, you're asking about the incentives to implement international law from the perspective of foreign countries. Is that?
That's right. So just to be a bit clearer, the more robust systems of law that exist in the international, in the context, in the globe, really are at the municipal or domestic level. And states have international obligations that they take on the international plane. And oftentimes they implement those obligations domestically. So universal jurisdiction, for instance, or legislating grave breaches of the Fourth Geneva Convention domestically and pursuing individuals for violations of the grave breaches regime as domesticated in those third states. What options exist, for instance, for third states to press points of principle where a collective action is made impossible at a broader level in the General Assembly or elsewhere?
No, I think that's a very important question, and it goes to supplement what can the world do given the inability of the UN to play a role in transforming the situation of the Palestinian people. And I think, for instance, the US could impose unilaterally an arms embargo, which would have immense psychopolitical effect and lead to what I think Michael alluded to, that what sorts of pressures would lead the Israeli elites to reconsider their political options. In other words, the South African transformational politics provides a very instructive model, I think, for how to proceed in the context of Israel. And it was domestic political movements that led the US and the UK against their strategic interests to impose sanctions eventually on South Africa, to support the imposition of sanctions. And it seems to me that that kind of militant activism focusing on governments of critical countries could be very effective both in itself and in leading the UN to a position of first embarrassment, and secondly maybe responding in such a way as to recognize the failures to exercise its responsibility. And if I can just end by asking what amounts to a question of Michael, which is, there was the wall opinion, very one-sided, strong opinion that was completely disregarded by Israel with no adverse consequence. Is there any more reason to think that an advisory opinion on prolonged occupation wouldn't be disregarded similarly with the jurisprudential emphasis that, after all, this is only advisory, it isn't obligatory, a position the US relied on in the nuclear weapons case. And so I favor also the recourse to the advisory opinion, but I wouldn't have very high expectations that it will change the policies being pursued by Israel. It will be a contribution to what I've been calling the legitimacy war, and that's, as I believe, very important. But it's a tangential to the role of international judicial institutions in promoting respect for international law.
Well, as usual, Richard, you're asking questions that go to the very heart of the issue and which need to be addressed. Basically, I think what you're asking me is, if we put, or if the world puts, or the Palestinians put an immense amount of political capital, which they don't have very much of, into asking the General Assembly to put a new advisory opinion with respect to the legality of the occupation to the ICJ, and in fact they're successful at the ICJ, what real difference could that make? I guess I'd answer it in these ways. First of all, the question, as important as it was, that was put to the ICJ in 2003 and 2004 was, is it legal for Israel to build the wall where it was built, which is 85% of it was in occupied territory? You know, that's an important question, but it's an important secondary question with respect to the occupation. I think, you know, what the value of putting the question I'm proposing, is the Israeli occupation still legal? I think there's a high odds of getting an answer that no, it's illegal under the laws of occupation. But B, that question, and ideally that answer, goes to the very heart of what this issue is all about. I think it's a great step forward with respect to pushing for an end to the occupation and for Palestinian self-determination. You know, I think it's been said a number of times, whether in the end of the day you believe in the eventuality of a two-state solution, or if you say a two-state solution's day has passed, we have to work for a one-state democratic solution. I think no matter where you land on those questions, you have to argue that the occupation must come to an end. And if the occupation is indeed determined to be illegal, then you're going to the very heart of the issue of exactly what you've raised, Richard, with respect to the issue of legitimacy and the legitimacy debates with regards to this. If I can then also just use my time right now to answer Ardi's question, what about the issue of using national legal forums to be able to push the questions of particularly are leading Israeli political, administrative, and military figures possibly in breach of war crimes under the Rome Statute? That's an interesting strategy. You know, on the positive side, we have to point out that a number of states have incorporated the Rome Statute into their domestic laws, including my own country of Canada. And at the very heart of what are designated to be war crimes under the Rome Statute are settlements. And virtually every country that has incorporated the Rome Statute into their domestic legislation has kept all of the definitions of war crimes, including settlements in occupied territory as war crimes, into their domestic legislation. the challenge always is, in many cases, countries have been careful. I'm talking particularly about North Canada and Europe, have put in filters in when they incorporated the Rome Statute into their domestic legislation to ensure that a complaint couldn't go forth or action couldn't go forth unless it first received the approval of the Attorney General of the country, and that always has been a problem because it provides this political filter by which to discard and protect Israel against the consequences of its own action. So, while I'm very much in favor of wanting to go forward on issues with respect to war crimes in domestic national forums, I think it has to be done very carefully, and it has to be done very strategically by whatever legal team is being incorporated by there.
Thank you, Michael. John, did you have something?
Yes, I'd like to make 2 points. First of all, just to let listeners know that on the 7th of December, an important decision will be taken by the appeal court in The Hague in a case brought by a Palestinian, Mr. Zaida, against the present Israeli Minister of Defense, Benny Gantz. He claims and argues that Benny Gantz, while he was the general in charge of Operation Protective Edge, was responsible for killing his family in Gaza. Mr. Zaida is a Dutch citizen, so the court does have jurisdiction. But Mr. Gantz has raised the question of immunity. He argues that as an Israeli senior official and now Minister of Defense is entitled to immunity, and the Dutch court will pronounce on that issue on the 7th of December. And I think it's a very important decision. But I would just like to return to Michael's view about the importance of an advisory opinion. The 2004 advisory opinion has to a large extent failed not only because states have failed to carry out or give effect to the sentiments of the court in that advisory opinion, which was, after all, only advisory, but the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Secretariat has also failed to lead the United Nations in this respect. And it's important to stress that in 2004, the Deputy Legal Advisor of the Office of Legal Affairs in the United Nations gave an opinion, which I find extraordinary, in which he advised the Secretary General that he was under no obligation to give effect in any way to the advisory opinion. So to a large extent, the Deputy Counsel of the Office of Legal Affairs was responsible for vetoing compliance with the advisory opinion on the part of the United Nations. And it's extraordinary that that decision by an officer of the United Nations has to a large extent gone unnoticed. And this simply reinforces my view that one has to get the senior officials of the Secretariat of the United Nations on board.
Thank you very much, John, for that, for those very important points. I have one last question, and then we can open it up to Q&A from the rest of our participants. And it goes to the exchange we've had just now on the ICJ second advisory opinion and what added value might be found in it. I've recently written an article in the European Journal of International Law that argues that if a second advisory opinion is had and determines that Israel's position in the OPT is illegal as such, the regime is illegal as such, the law of state responsibility requires Israel to end the occupation forthwith and unconditionally. And this goes to, I think, undermining what I call the negotiations condition. There is a universal position held at the United Nations that the only way to end the occupation is through bilateral negotiations or multilateral negotiations between the occupying power, immensely powerful, operating in bad faith, and the Palestinian people who are living underfoot of the occupying power. They have no power whatsoever. So the power imbalance between them at the negotiating table, even if there were negotiations, would not necessarily produce an equitable result. What are your views on the negotiation condition imposed, if you like, impliedly by the United Nations universally on the parties to this conflict? Problem?
Let me begin, if I can. What the post-colonial era, I think, has, or the decolonization era has taught us from 1945 onward, is that virtually every situation where a people under colonialism were negotiating for an end to their subordinate status and seeking independence and self-determination, they were negotiating not over the specific terms of how much longer the occupier could wind up staying, or what rights the occupier continued to have in the occupied country. They were negotiating simply for a total, complete end to the occupation or the end of colonialism. There are very few exceptions to this in the modern world, and I think that accords, Ardi, with your argument in the article that you've wound up mentioning. You're only negotiating as to when and how soon you're going to be leaving my land, and I'm going to be able to set up the institutions to be a new independent state. The only exceptions I can think of are two. One is with respect to Ireland, is that the negotiations that led to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 were in effect a continuation of British rule over Northern Ireland, which interestingly enough drew inspiration from the Oslo negotiations or process that began in 1991 in Madrid and then continued from the 1993 Declaration of Principles, which leads me obviously to the second point, is that what's happened with respect to Palestine over the last 30 years, and Madrid process started 30 years ago last month in October, is over how much Israel is going to be able to continue with its annexation of land, its continuation of at least some of the settlements, its continuation of its holding over all of or most of Jerusalem. So all of this tells me is that the framework of realpolitik, which has been the diplomatic playbook we've been using consistently for the last 30 years from Madrid in 1991, is yesterday's playbook. There have been several recent, very incisive reports that have come out. The one I will commend in particular is from earlier on this year from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which said that the diplomatic realpolitik playbook from that has been used up until now with a great series of failures has to be replaced by a rights-based framework. And a rights-based framework would use, obviously, the framework of international law. It would use the framework of UN resolutions to be able to say, when they sit down again, with, first of all, the supervision of the international community operating on the basis of rights and UN resolutions, it'll be to end completely the Israeli occupation, not to negotiate over how much Israel is allowed to retain with respect to that. And that would be consistent, as I said, with this entire era of decolonization over the last 75 years.
Thank you, Michael. John, Richard?
Yes, I could. I agree with what Michael has said. I remember that in the course of the Oslo diplomacy, Palestinians were advised informally by the U.S. Government not to raise international law issues, for instance, pertaining to the illegality of the settlements, because that would disrupt the negotiating process. It's just the opposite of what Michael has proposed. In other words, the Palestinians were told, well, wait till the final status negotiations come about, then you can raise your grievances under international law. But of course, Israel had no intention to get to the final status negotiations, and it used the process as a way of gaining time to expand the settlements and essentially to make withdrawal, if not impossible, much more problematic, with hundreds of thousands of settlers to persuade to leave the settlements or to be forced to leave the settlements. So I think it's extremely important to understand that a rights-based framework for diplomacy is a precondition for meaningful negotiations leading to a sustainable peace. But even that is, in my view, somewhat problematic without a geopolitical shift away from unconditional support for Israel as a Jewish state operating within an apartheid structure. You could have, again, a situation where the negotiations stalled or even reached some sort of provisional conclusions, and Israel completely ignored them and was supported de facto by the United States and maybe the EU. So it takes more than international law and a rights-based framework to change the political equation, in my view. And that's why I come back to militant activism as an essential complement to the emphasis on empowering the General Assembly or seeking law-based solutions, either domestically or internationally.
Thank you, Richard. John?
Yes, of course, the insistence on the part of European states and the United States that the future of Palestine can only be resolved by means of negotiations between the two states, Palestine and Israel, is completely ridiculous. I think the Oslo process showed that you'll recall that on that occasion, as Richard rightly pointed out, the Palestinians were persuaded to go into the negotiations without proper legal advice or without any real international lawyers to advise them, whereas the government of Israel was advised and led by its legal team completely. So I think one must realize that you cannot have fair negotiations between a dominant power on the one hand and a weak power on the other. Negotiations will have to be carried out with an honest broker, and I think it's generally agreed that the United States is neither honest nor a broker in this process. So the United Nations will have to appoint some other body in order to ensure that negotiations are fair, but at the same time, negotiations must be premised on the understanding that there will be due respect for international law. For instance, the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits the annexation or the handing over of territory on the part of the occupied power to the occupying power. And so this idea of land swaps is not something that should really be on the table in any negotiations. So one has to insist on fair negotiations based on respect for international law.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for the conversation. I propose now to turn it over to the audience. We've got a whole host of questions that have been asked, and so with your permission, I'm going to take us through some. And for our audience members, please keep in mind, I can't put all of the questions to the special rapporteurs, but we'll do my best to summarize some of them if they're the same. One question comes from Francesca Albanese. In fact, it's two questions. Are there any General Assembly member states that you see potentially eager to propose or impose sanctions against Israel? And what is your advice to NGOs and other organizations, community-based organizations, who are trying to carry that accountability agenda forward? Any takers on that question?
Well, let me say as a South African that I think one state that has made it very clear that it is determined to take strong action is South Africa. It's interesting that South Africa is the only state that has condemned the declaration of the 6 human rights defender organizations as terrorist organizations. Of course, South Africa has suffered under apartheid, and it knows apartheid when it sees it, and so it feels very strongly about the subject. But one state is not enough, and this is where I think it's important that the former colonial states join South Africa in insisting on UN action.
Thank you, John.
If I can just add to that, it may be as well, though, that this is going to require a strategic decisions from the Palestinian Authority itself. I think the world, in many ways, member states from Africa and Asia, formerly colonialized countries, as well as the non-governmental organization movement and civil society, are in many ways probably thirsty to have clear direction from the Palestinian leadership as to where they should be going. It's obvious that the channels that Palestine has tried to follow in the United Nations and elsewhere have really been ended up in cul-de-sacs. Is a two-state solution still a viable aspiration for the Palestinians to follow? Yes, they should be. The Palestinians are right to demand an end to occupation, but whether or not that will lead to a genuine two-state solution in current or foreseeable circumstances is something else. And I think in some ways, there hasn't been the kind of strategic vision that both civil society can rally around, and that many member states who I think are natural allies of the Palestinians can rally around. So, for all the things we can ask the international community that's sympathetic to the question of Palestine, there needs to be. I think we're in an era now where we need to have a new direction from the Palestinians that points the way forward, in the very same way that through the 1970s and 1980s, the ANC provided both very clear strategic direction for the world on isolating South Africa, but also envisaging what kind of post-apartheid society it was interested in wanting to create. And that, I think, appealed to the aspirations of many to want to be part of this struggle to bring to an end of apartheid. Can the Palestinian leadership also deliver that kind of strategic aspiration as well?
Let me just to add to what Michael has said. I think he calls attention to, although he didn't put it quite this way, that one of the sources of failure or disappointment with the Palestinian struggle has been the absence of unified and effective leadership. And to some extent, the PA leadership has been co-opted by Israel and the US in playing a quasi-collaborative role, and depending on financial flows that are subject to Israeli and US control. Partly Israel has contributed to the fragmentation of Palestinian leadership by characterizing Hamas, even after it entered the political process, as a terrorist organization, making it difficult for other countries to follow. And the important point, I think, is that my experience in the UN is that most government delegations will not be moved to act, especially in controversial areas, unless the affected political authority pushes very hard. And the Palestinian leadership has not pushed very hard. In fact, they've taken, in some contexts, positions that were deliberately moderating what could have been a more challenging set of initiatives. And I refer particularly to the way in which the Palestinian Authority helped with the marginalization of the Goldstone report after Operation Cast Lead, and further the way in which the Palestinian Authority weakened General Assembly resolutions on several occasions. During my term as Special Rapporteur, I happened to be very friendly with the president of the General Assembly during that period, who was a former Nicaraguan foreign minister, who was very sympathetic with the Palestinian cause, and he constantly had to defend his more militant positions against the Palestinian Authority that was arguing for not upsetting the Europeans and not displeasing Washington. So the problem of Palestinian leadership is quite central to what we've been talking about.
Thank you. Another question from Susan Akram. In all of your experiences as special rapporteurs on the OPT, could you share your observations about the extent to which you believe your reporting to the UN had pushed the envelope in putting pressure on states to re-examine their support for what is happening on the ground and their support for Israel? Thank you. John, why don't we go with you? Any thoughts about how you might have helped push the envelope?
Yes, well, I had one major success, and that was on the wall. In 2003, I started to report on the construction of the wall, and that was taken up by states and by the General Assembly and by the Palestinian ambassador, and ultimately the advisory opinion was requested. But that's really the only occasion on which I felt that I had achieved anything. On other occasions, I was labeled by many European delegates as being part of the problem and not part of the solution. And I think this is probably a problem that Richard and Michael have also experienced.
Yes, I certainly experienced that problem in rather intense ways. And I would say, though, that the success of the reports in my period, I would measure mainly by influencing a little bit the discourse within the UN, that it became somewhat more acceptable to talk about colonialism and apartheid in the context of the Israel-Palestine struggle. John started this process in his final report, and I continued to stress these issues. And I think the discourse is influential principally in established NGO and civil society groups like the World Council of Church. A lot of important civil society organizations I found rely on these reports for their informational and normative basis for taking action. I did have a couple of experiences, one with the pre-Bolsonaro Brazilian government, which told me, the foreign minister told me that they relied very much on our report in order to shape their policy on Israel-Palestine. And that happened, I'd say, 2 or 3 times in my 6 years.
Regards to my reports, I've got to confess, I'm not a great gardener, but I've always believed in the idea of, what you plant will blossom later on. And I see that, I think, with respect to my reports. First of all, I think, particularly with my October 2017 report advocating for a second advisory opinion, I think there's gathering forces that are paying much closer attention to the idea, not simply my idea, that going for a second advisory opinion has a lot of strategic and legal sense to it. But I'll also say, I think our reports have a lot of importance in themselves, because I think, first of all, they reflect some of the very best of UN thinking. Certainly, I've spoken to a number of UN officers who work closely on the issue of Israel and Palestine, who will say things to me that they don't say in their own reporting. They face their own boundaries, but are glad to see that there is an outlet within the UN system where these things can be said. And as well, I frequently rely upon civil society for their advocacy and for the quality of their own reports. And those are reflected, I guess, in shaping my own thinking and my own writing in these particular reports. And I think they're grateful for that they can find these greater expressions for the positions that they wind up taking, find a voice through the UN Special Rapporteur. So I see lots of sense and lots of value in the kinds of reports that I've done. And certainly I'm standing on the shoulders of giants with respect to the reporting that John and Richard have done before me.
Thank you very much. This is a question that is coming out through some of the Q&A, but also in my engagement with folks in the world around me concerning Palestine's statehood. There's some people who believe that the juridical existence of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip is mere symbolism, that this state, because it is under occupation and not truly free, only perpetuates more of a problem than bringing with it some form of solution. I wonder what your thoughts are on the value of Palestine as a state in the international legal order, and in particular, the importance of the moves at the ICC in this regard, and possibly the ICJ, given the events going on there. Why don't we begin with you, John?
Yes, well, I think it's commonly known that I'm a proponent of Palestinian statehood. I do think that it has certain distinct advantages, and I'm pleased that the International Criminal Court has recognized its existence as a state, albeit only within the context of the ICC. The matter is still before the ICJ. I do think it's important that Palestinian statehood become recognized, because until that happens, Palestine will not be taken seriously.
Thank you. Michael, Richard?
I essentially have nothing to add to what John has said. I mean, I think the ability to participate in international society depends on achieving the status of statehood. So access to the International Criminal Court is extremely important, and the ability to participate in treaty-making frameworks and secondary institutions of the UN itself, like UNESCO, and having more status in the general, in relation to the General Assembly is important, symbolically and substantively. I think there are certain disadvantages that are pointed to by the question. There's no doubt that it doesn't seem like a state in relation to its domestic reality, because it's at once acting somewhat independently internationally, but it's completely paralyzed with respect to its own people and its own internal reality.
And I have nothing further to add, though that your question, I think, already was eloquently answered by both Richard and John. And I humbly cannot add anything further than that, other than to associate myself entirely with what they've said.
Wonderful. I suppose we'll go with one last question, and then I'll offer some concluding remarks before we head on to our special presentation. A number of participants are asking questions about the impact of the Abraham Accords. Any views on the move by Israel and other members of the Arab world to sort of create relations, and what the impact of those types of accords will have on the situation going forward? Why don't we begin with you, Richard?
Yes, I think that the Abraham Accords, first of all, have to be seen as opportunistic arrangements that gave countries incentives to normalize relations with Israel during the Trump era and beyond, with Biden as well. And it was part of an attempt in the region to create an anti-Iran coalition. It gave several of the countries weapons procurements that they desired. In Morocco's case, it resulted in a unilateral declaration by the U.S. government that it supported Morocco in its Western Sahara claims of territorial sovereignty, which of course is legally irrelevant, but geopolitically significant. And generally, I think it should be understood that these regimes in the region don't speak for the public. They're authoritarian regimes opportunistically relating to their economic and political interests in survival and in shaping the region according to their own special interests. And so I think it's a very shaky from Israel's point of view, as UAE has recently indicated a variance from what Israel expected by its overtures to Turkey, for instance. So it's a complicated story, and it's partly a legacy of Trump's one-sidedness in the region, bribing these governments to enter into relations. It's partly also that these regimes see the Palestinian struggle as a lost cause. That's the most damaging, perhaps, from the Palestinian point of view, that this is possible because they see it as a lost cause. They see their domestic control as sufficiently unchallengeable that they can ignore their own public opinion, because the public opinion of the Arab world continues to be overwhelmingly supportive of the Palestinian struggle. So it's revealing in a number of ways, and I've touched on just a few.
I'll be very quick, Ardi, because I know we're moving on to another stage of this panel. But I think the test, and I hear that in what Richard has said, I think the test is, do something like the Abraham Accords bring an end to the occupation and the realization of Palestinian self-determination closer, or does it push it further away? That's what I think you have to ask yourself. And I think it's indisputable that the way in which Israel has treated the Abraham Accords is a legitimization of its control over the occupied territories, and a further lessening of international pressure and spotlight on the injustices of its occupation. I see no evidence over the last year and a half that the Abraham Accords have done anything but assist Israel in consolidating its de facto annexation of the occupied territories.
Quick answer from me. Richard has rightly said that the Abraham Accords are part of the Trump legacy, but one must remember that the Trump legacy also includes the relocation of the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And it's sad to note that the Biden administration has continued with these decisions on the part of the Trump administration. And to a large extent, this simply confirms my view that the United States cannot be considered as a state capable of becoming or ever being an honest broker in any peace process.
Thank you very, very much for those concluding remarks on your part, John. I think I'd like to just end as I began with a quote. In his 1993 monograph, Representations of the Intellectual, Edward Said wrote that Palestine is an issue, and I quote, where fear of speaking out about one of the greatest injustices in modern history has hobbled, blinkered, muzzled many who know the truth and are in a position to serve it. For despite the abuse and vilification that any outspoken supporter of Palestinian rights and self-determination earns for him or herself, the truth deserves to be spoken, represented by an unafraid and compassionate intellectual, end quote. I think you would agree with me that our three panelists are the perfect embodiment of the unafraid and compassionate intellectual of which Professor Said spoke. We thank each of you, John, Richard, and Michael, for providing examples of what it means to be an engaged scholar in the world, striving to speak truth to power and blazing trails for all to follow with a view to creating a more just and peaceful reality, including for the people of Palestine. Whatever criticism the United Nations may reasonably be subjected to, your collective body of work as independent experts for the UN stands testament to its continued value and importance. What is equally true, however, is that that value will only be fully realized if men and women of conviction and character dare to take up the challenge your individual and collective legacies leave us. I have every confidence that that challenge will be met. So with that said, I think the organizers of this conference have a special presentation to make. And so I'd like to hand it over to Michael to share a word or two before we then pass over to Hassan. Michael?
Thank you very much for this, Ardi. It's, as I said at the very beginning 2 hours ago, what an honor it is to be on the same panel on the same stage internationally as Richard and John, in my view, but in the view of many, many people across the world, they're icons among international human rights lawyers. By their willingness to use their already well-established reputations as rights-seeking lawyers and academics to become special rapporteurs on the question of Palestine, both of them have immeasurably elevated the spotlight and the impact of this particular mandate. Whatever I've been able to accomplish as special rapporteur on human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, it's largely because John and Richard both took their roles as special rapporteurs for this mandate seriously enough and professionally enough to say truthfully and out loud what was happening before their eyes when very few people in international authority were, and unfortunately still are, willing to do so. This recognition by Birzeit University, the academic citadel of Palestine, is a wonderful and well-deserved honor to these two human rights giants, and I'm pleased to have a small role in acknowledging their contributions. Ardi?
Thank you, Michael. Over to you, Hassan.
Thank you so much, Ardi, for the brilliant moderation. Thanks, Michael, Richard, and John for the fruitful and wonderful insight indeed. So, my dear professors, Richard and John, I'm standing in front of you today virtually, two real icons as a child indeed, not in the sense of age, but in the sense of lack of knowledge, lack of depth, but at the same time, the desire to learn. In fact, if I try to think back to how I was inspired to pursue and study law while I'm making my way today as a PhD scholar, I find that my knowledge of international law started with you and still grows with all the knowledge you have offered and still offer. Thank you for all the inspiration you have given, not only to me personally, but to all those who seek to push for justice and emancipation in the face of those working to ensure it's never realized. The path you have forged in international law will remain forever open. We and history are witness to your work and efforts. Words indeed cannot express how pleased I am today to be able to honor you and to organize for this event. This event means so much to us at Law for Palestine in our path for justice. Thank you for accepting this. I also want to express my gratitude to Birzeit University, whose administration did everything in their capacity to turn this event into reality. Here, allow me to pass the mic to the representative of the university, Dr. Iyad Tamour, Assistant Vice President for Academic Affairs, to present the university's award. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Iyad Tamour. I am the Assistant Vice President for Academic Affairs. If you allow me at the beginning to give like short speech in Arabic, then I will switch to English, because I believe maybe we have many participants who would like to hear what we want to say in Arabic at Birzeit or from Birzeit University. السيدات والسادة كل باسمه ولقبه، نود أن نتقدم في جامعة بيرزيت من شركائنا وجميع المتحدثين والمشاركين في هذا المؤتمر الهام بالشكر والتقدير على وقتهم وعلى جهودهم العظيمة التي بذلوها طيلة اليوم والأسابيع السابقة، والتي تسهم إيجابا بلا شك في دعم مساعي تحقيق العدالة للشعب الفلسطيني. نأمل أن تستمر مثل هذه المؤتمرات، ونحن دوما في جامعة بيرزيت نسعد بالمشاركة في تنظيمها ودعمها. باسم جامعة بيرزيت رئيسا وعاملين وأكاديميين وطلبة، نود التعبير عن جزيل شكرنا وعظيم امتناننا لجميع المشاركين، وبشكل خاص للأستاذين الكبيرين ريتشارد فولك وجون دوغارد لمساهمتهم الأكاديمية الرائدة في حقل القانون الدولي وحقوق الإنسان، ولما بذلوه من جهود كبيرة في خدمة الشعب الفلسطيني والسعي لتحقيق العدالة له، سواء من موقعهما في الأمم المتحدة كمقررين لحالة حقوق الإنسان في فلسطين المحتلة، أو من خلال مناصرتهم للحقوق الفلسطينية في المنابر الدولية. وبهذه المناسبة يسرني أن أقدم درع الجامعة للأستاذين القديرين ريتشارد فولك وجون دوغارد، وسنقوم بإرسال هذه الدروع لهما من خلال البريد. كما نعرب في جامعة بيرزيت عن سعادتنا وعن جزيل شكرنا البالغ لقبول الأستاذين ريتشارد فولك وجون دوغارد. نيتنا في جامعة بيرزيت منحهما لقب أستاذ شرف الذي نأمل أن يساهم إيجاباً في خدمة رسالة ورؤية الجامعة في قادم الأيام. Thank you very much all participants in this really important conference. I would like to thank and appreciate our partners, speakers, all participants in this significant conference for their time, great efforts they did throughout this day and previous weeks. These efforts undoubtedly contribute positively to supporting struggles to achieve justice for the Palestinian people. We wish you and we hope this conference will continue, and we wish long sustainability for this conference in the future. And we are always ready and happy to participate and organize and support this conference in the future. I'm here to represent Birzeit University in expressing our great thanks and our great gratitude to all participants, especially for the two great professors, Richard Falk and John Dugard, for their remarkable academic contributions in the field of international law and human rights, and for all their great efforts in serving rights of the Palestinian people, both from their previous positions at the United Nations as rapporteurs of the human rights situation in the occupied Palestine, or through their advocacy for Palestine rights in international forums. The university also expressed its great pleasure that the two professors accepted the university offer with its intention to grant them the title of emeritus professors, which we hope will contribute positively to serving the mission and the vision of Birzeit University in the coming days. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Dr. Iyad. Thanks to Birzeit University. Now I should pass the mic to Law for Palestine's chairman of the Board of Trustees, Dr. Murtaz Qafishe, to present the award on behalf of Law for Palestine. Dr. Murtaz, the mic is yours. It seems you are muted, Dr. Murtaz.
Yes, thank you, Ihsan. Just in my capacity as the head of Board of Trustees of Law of Palestine, I would just like to add a few words to both Richard and John. We should recognize with honor, all Palestinians should recognize, all Palestinian law students and law professors, that we all are students of you both great heroes of the question of Palestine. You are more Palestinians than most Palestinians. You wrote about Palestine and international law than any Palestinian ever has been written on the question of Palestine. So I think what you have achieved would remain generations or even centuries to come. We will all always remember you with great appreciation and honor. I personally have some just a few words about my personal experience with both John and Richard. You know, as you may know, I worked at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Palestine, and I worked with John Dugard for a few years. I could experience and see in my eye how he was dealing with the question of Palestine, not as a UN official, but also as we say in French, militant de droit de l'homme, as an activist, defender of human rights. I still remember how we one day were stopped by Israeli soldiers at a checkpoint near the youth village. And John, you remember, I think very well, how the Israeli soldiers were pointing their guns on the car where John was sitting, and he was courageously confronted the soldiers and asked them to allow us to continue our mission. So we should say, John, we really love you, as we say it in Palestine. And with regard to Richard Falk, as we all know, as teachers of international law and students of international law, that any professor of international law in the world, not only in Palestine, learns from Richard Falk's scholarship. You, as everybody should know, you were the most cited law professor in international law in the world, not only with regard to the question of Palestine. Anyone who studied international law could not understand international law without Richard Falk scholarship. I still remember one day when I asked Richard Falk to write an introduction to a book that I edited. I expected that Richard would write maybe half a page or maybe 1 page about the content of that book, but I discovered that Richard read the whole book. It was 500 pages. He read it entirely, and that was clear from the 5-page introduction that he wrote to my book. So whatever words that we say would not be able to give you justice, both our heroes. So thank you very much, and please allow me to present our modest present to you both. It's a small portrait that was drawn, painted by two of our friend of the law of Palestine. They are both Rawan Haj Yunus and Ghufran Haj Yunus. They are both artists from Syria. They wrote this portrait for you, and we hope that you will like it. So it's shown now on the screen, and we'll be happy to send it to you by post in the near future. Thank you very much again and again.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mu'taz. Back to you, Ardi. The mic is yours.
Well, thank you very much for passing the mic on to me. Why don't we hear from our esteemed panelists and the emeritus professors, Richard Falk and John Dugard. Which one of you would like to address us first?
Well, shall I go first as the earlier rapporteur? Just let me say how delighted and pleased I am to have been honored in this way by the University of Birzeit. I have visited the University of Birzeit on many occasions while I was special rapporteur and also thereafter, and I really am delighted by this honor. It does bring my closeness to the Palestinian people even closer, and I would also like to recall the occasion on which Ustaz and I were confronted with by the IDF when I was special rapporteur. It was a very memorable occasion for me as well. So thank you very, very much. I'm deeply honored by this award.
It's an honor to us.
Let me add my sense of appreciation, being very moved by the remarks that were made by previous speakers. It culminates, this attachment to Birzeit culminates my long engagement with the Palestinian struggle. And it's been an engagement that, although it's brought many practical difficulties in my life, has also been a source of inspiration and gratification. I've had contact with many wonderful Palestinian people who have maintained a position of resistance and struggle and human compassion under the most difficult of circumstances. And for me, the Palestinian movement was a sequel to my own involvement with the opposition to the Vietnam War, and it represents a sense of continuity of trying to make the world more compatible with the aspirations embodied in human rights as a perspective that challenges the political realists who shape the geopolitical configurations that have caused so much human suffering. So this is a wonderful experience for me, and it reinforces my commitment to the Palestinian people.
Well, Richard, John, thank you so very much for everything, for your comments, for your time today, and most importantly, for the examples that you've set for all of us who deal with international law, the question of Palestine, and even broader than that, justice in the world. Friends, colleagues, I think that brings us to the end of this panel, but I do believe we may have some more. Hassan, would you like to guide us?
Yes, no, we are done with this session. Now we are moving to the next session with the Aya Khalaf, who we
Wonderful.
can see now in the, yeah.
Thank you very much. I saw Aya's face, so I wasn't sure if we'd come to an end. So that brings us to the end of this panel. Thank you so very much. I personally would like to thank the special rapporteurs, of course, but also Law for Palestine, Birzeit University, and the Independent Commission of Human Rights. Wishing you all well, and continue to strive for justice. Be well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And a special word of thanks to you, Ardi.
He deserves.
Thank you. This is the first time I've ever moderated anything, so I'm rather pleased with it. Well done.
You were a great success.
Take care.
That.